Hello, everybody. I'm Rita Turpin, and I'm hosting today's talk that I'm very excited for. And we are part of the Science Basement. And the Science Basement is a nonprofit, and we're a group of researchers in training, and we want to practice how to communicate our research with not just the people that are around us in our daily lives, but also with the general public. And some of the things we do is we have this afternoon talk series, which is happening right now. So public speaking, we invite researchers from the University of Helsinki, mostly PhD students, but we also do podcasts, so interviews, we do blogs on our website. And when Corona allows, we go to do school visits and we do workshops. We've been to museums, we work with kids, young adults. So basically anybody who will listen, we will communicate with them. We have some social media channels. So we have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and then we have our website. And this right here is the team that puts specifically this talk series together. So all the different projects have their own little teams. And I am just so grateful for everybody here because there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes. And then I wanted to mention that we are part of this year of research-based knowledge. So it's this initiative by the Ministry of Education and Culture, Academy of Finland, Federation of Finnish Learned Societies. And the idea here is to make research more accessible and to really make transparent how research is done. How do we generate the knowledge? So that will kind of bridge the gap between the people who kind of take in the research and the ones who make it. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to give a talk at one of our series, just contact this email afternoons@thesciencebasement.org. You can reach out to us at social media. At the moment, this email just directly goes to me, so at least you'll know who's going to be receiving that email. And I think that is that. So I'll stop sharing so that I can introduce now our speaker. So today we have Daniel Kawecki. He's a doctoral student in political science at the University of Helsinki. And today's topic is political polarization. And he has his master's degree from Abo Academy University. And his work is done now with the Society for Swedish Literature in Finland. Yeah, so they are the ones who are then funding his work towards his doctorate. So maybe without further ado, I think Daniel would like to begin by sharing another very quick poll just to get your head in the right space for his talk.
Some are very worried about polarization. Most are somewhat worried, but hope it will settle down. So, okay, but only a few are not worried. Yeah, and most have a general sense of where they belong politically, which I suppose is to be expected. It's quite a normal distribution on that question. And this is perhaps the most interesting. Yeah, a few, and there's quite a lot of spread here. Some are hanging out with mostly people who share their own views. Other have lots of people to discuss politics with. So yeah, and good. A couple of people think this was a silly question. That's a nice one. Great. So politics is silly enough to be taken seriously, or is it the other way around? It's serious enough to be silly. And okay, yeah, and most people feel affected in one way or another by polarization. So thank you. This was to sort of get you in the right mindset and start thinking about these things. So I'll close the results now and go to my presentation. There we go. It should be visible now for everyone. Yeah, so political polarization is a topic we encounter when we watch the news or we follow our social media flows, and we sometimes we don't be targeted by it if we stick our head out and discuss difficult topics. And what most of what we see about it's rather ugly. It's conflict. It's violent. It's incivility, anger. But still, is there a point to it? Is it just leading in a bad direction? Could there be something good coming out of it also? So this is the topic for my talk. But before we get to that question, I will a little bit sort of tell you about exactly what kind of research I am doing and how it ties into this subject. So just shortly, the introduction. Rita already told this, so but I became a doctoral student at the University of Helsinki in 2019. So I've been doing this for about 2 years now. And I'm funded by my research is funded by the Society for Swedish Literature in Finland. So I have my actual workplace is there, but I'm studying at the university. So how does one begin to become interested in researching political polarization? Well, in my case, it began some 20 years ago in Sweden. So I'm born in Sweden and grew up there. And at some point as a young man, I started paying attention to politics. And I noticed rather quickly that there was a couple of things that disturbed me. There was the Swedes are doing politics in a frustrating way. One of the things I noticed was it was more important who said something more than what was said. So if a person on the wrong side of a political debate said something that made sense, it didn't matter because he or she was on the wrong side. So you couldn't listen to that, and you had to attack the person instead. And second, as soon as there was a debate about something interesting that could lead in some useful direction, it always sort of devolved into a debate about the debate. Is this a legitimate topic to debate? Do we do it in the right way? Your way of debating this is wrong, and so on. So it became a debate about the debate. And well, this is a very good way of not getting anywhere or getting anything done, but only making people angry and disappointed and frustrated. Of course, this was a bit confusing to me. So I was wondering, but why is it this way? And what was the problem? And well, at that time, I didn't think of it in terms of polarization. So, but it made me interesting in politics. So I decided to actually go study political science at the university. And was very interested in different kind of ideologies and ways, different views of democracy, because much of the debate there was a lot of accusations about what one side or another side did was undemocratic in different ways. So it was interesting to know what that was about. But during these studies, something happened. I met my wife, and she was from Finland. So I did the reasonable thing and moved to Finland, continuing my studies in political science here in Finland. And as it happened, when I moved to Finland, I think it was 2003, and there was an upcoming national election in Finland. So I, of course, put on the television and watched the national election debates on TV. And I was amazed by what I saw. It was nothing like what I was used to from Sweden. Here in the studio, it was actually people were discussing like reasonable, responsible adults actually speaking to each other, even though they were from completely different political camps, and having a discussion. I didn't know this was possible. So I was wondering, was Finland some kind of political paradise? Well, of course, the Finnish, this kind of consensus-based culture has its own backsides, I've learned over time. But nonetheless, I really liked this. It was a welcome contrast to what the kind of political debates are used from in Sweden. So I was quite happy with this. I finished my studies in political science and did a lot of other things in life. Unfortunately, it seems that nothing good lasts forever. I mean, over the years now, it feels like the general political discussion in Finland is becoming more and more to what I was used to from Sweden. And what I now see in my previous home country, Sweden, it sort of goes in the direction of the United States. And we have all seen what happens in the United States over the recent years. It's not pretty, and we wouldn't want to go too far in that direction. So I'm becoming increasingly worried about where the current political climate is taking us. So what to do about it? Well, it appears that the only reasonable thing to do here too was to actually go back to academia and write a doctoral thesis, of course, about it. What else could you do? Well, okay, we could argue if it's the reasonable thing to do or not, but nonetheless, here we are discussing political polarization. So at least it leads somewhere. Now, let's look. What is a political polarization, and what does it actually mean? Generally speaking, when we think of political polarization, it's a division into groups, separate groups, us against them. Some controversial issue is splitting people into separate groups. And there's increasing hostility between those two groups over this issue. And a third part of this, which is sometimes overlooked, is the emptying middle ground, meaning that as this topic is becoming more and more hotly debated, people tend to lean one way or another, or at least away from one direction, slightly towards the other. And those that sort of try to remain in the middle and seeing points in both sides, they end up getting attacked by both the extreme parts of both sides and sort of withdraw or get silent or get pushed in one direction or another. So soon there is very silent in the middle, and all you hear is voices from the sort of the end points of the division. However, for most of us, we are stuck there somewhere in the middle. We are not doing, I hope, the hate speech on social media or rioting or political violence. We just try to make sense of what is going on, and thus we tend to lean one way or another on issues. And these slight leanings or group alignments makes us part of a greater pattern of polarization in society. We like in the poll questions, most of us tend to know sort of where we belong and at least where we do not belong, and that those patterns form polarization. Polarization in a way is something we can't really avoid. It's not a question of if political polarization exists in society, it's a question of how much polarization we have in society. And now the next thing we might ask ourselves about political polarization is if it's about ideology or emotions, because in a way we have touched on both. We have both discussed dividing on an issue, extreme opinions, and that's part of ideological thinking. But we have also discussed hostility between groups, and that's more of an emotional thing. So let's unpack this a little bit. The traditional understanding of political polarization is almost exclusively focused on ideological distance. So the idea is that the further apart the opinions are of these groups, the more polarization we have. This view is reflected in, for example, concepts such as echo chambers, which means that we have a sort of psychological mechanism that it's unpleasant for us to engage with opinions that question our view of reality. So we sort of tend to filter them out and seek out opinions that confirm our previous views of reality. So we tend to get into sort of these bubbles or chambers where our own opinions are reflected and confirmed and this pushes opinions generally in a more extreme view when they aren't contradicted by other information. So you would think, okay, perhaps a solution to polarization would be then to actually engage more with the other side and hear contradicting arguments. Well, turns out that's not a good way either, necessarily. This view of polarization as echo chamber has come under criticism. It appears that people actually do engage with the other side, but some researchers want to view it, see it as a trench warfare dynamic. So it's not just that we get our own opinions reinforced through like-minded people, but when we engage with opposing opinions, that actually also entrenches us in our previous opinions. So when we meet this kind of contradiction or resistance, it makes us go back to our own side of trenches, dig deeper, and build more machine gun nests. And most of us were perhaps undecided. We are out there somewhere in between, in no man's land, hearing the bullets fly around our heads. But then about 10 years ago, some researchers in the United States published an influential paper where they argued about that this view of polarization as a question of ideology it's not complete. So what they wanted to do was reinterpret it in terms of affects, or I would say emotions, not ideological distances between groups, but emotional distances between groups. So the idea is no matter how close or far apart you are ideologically, emotions between groups can still become more and more hostile. So polarization could increase even without changes in opinions or ideology. So, and this kind of hostility between groups, of course, requires that we feel that we belong to political groups, but that's not an issue really. Sort of social psychologists have long been aware of a phenomenon called the minimal group paradigm, which sort of dictates that as soon as you divide people in a group, even on something really trivial, such as shirt color, let's say color of your shirt, red shirts there and blue shirts there, and people who are otherwise very similar to each other, as soon as you have some kind of artificial group division, people still go into this group mindset where they have biased in favor of their own group, not necessarily hostile towards the other group, but they will favor members of their own group over the other group. And if you further add to this some kind of competition or rivalry, then this kind of group dynamics also very easily triggers animosity or hostile feelings and biases towards the other groups, stereotypes, and all those kinds of things. So what this paper actually did then was propose a new way of viewing political polarization, and they called it affective political polarization. And this is exactly my research subject. So this kind of polarization is composed of positive sentiment for the group you feel you belong to, and negative feelings or sentiment towards rivaling groups. So the stronger you feel that you belong and like your own group, and the more you feel hostile towards the opposing group, the more polarization in society. Now we'll look at a real-world example of how this conceptualization can be used to measure how political polarization develops in society. Here we have the case of the United States, and a plot showing things. Now this can take a little bit to unpack, so I'll just do it bit by bit. So as you see here at the bottom scale, this is a timeline from the 1980s to almost present day. I believe it ends in 2018. I didn't find any more recent data. And here on the vertical axis, it shows it's a feeling thermometer. So people are asked, citizens are asked in a survey, but how do you feel towards the party you support, so either the Democrats or Republicans, and how do you feel towards the other party? And this is measured on a thermometer scale from 0, which means really cold feelings, and 100, which means warm feelings. So what we can see here in this picture is that the upper two lines, they show how much, how warmly Democrats feels towards their own party and Republicans feels towards their own party. You can see this is pretty stable over time. It doesn't change much, except here it's a little bit at the end. But if you look at the lower part, this is what they feel towards the opposing party. We see is okay from 1982 onwards, it's just a slight slope downwards, but then around the year 2000 something happens and this slope goes steeply, more and more steeply downwards up until a more recent time. So, and the distance between those two lines, which I marked here with a red arrow, this kind of gap, it's a measure of the amount of affective polarization between parties in a country. So this way we can actually see in numbers what's going on politically. Now in my case, of course, I'm not specifically studying the United States. I'm interested in Finland. So how do I go about and do this in Finland? Well, the main research questions I'm working with are, of course, first of all, is the question if affective polarization is at all increasing in Finland, because this hasn't really been researched so far, so we don't really know. The only thing we know that is in comparative studies, Finland is placed as one of the less polarized countries in a European perspective. But we don't know if it's increasing or stable. And second, I of course ask what's behind this? What is driving affective polarization? Why are some people more prone to becoming polarized than others, and so on? And the main things I'm looking at is if this is an ideological phenomenon. Is it sort of differences in opinions that drives this kind of feelings of hostility? Is it about political identities, this kind of us versus them, or is it something else? Now, this research is based on survey data from national election studies. I mean, during the last 5 national elections, or directly after them, there has been surveys which asked a bit about more than 1,000 citizens each time, or that's the response rate, about all kinds of political opinions, attitudes, background variables, and who they voted for, and so on. And this is a wealth of data to be used. And the specific question I'm most interested in is similar to the thermometer scale, which was used in the American research. It's a like-dislike rating of the different political parties, because, well, in the US it's simply of two parties. Here we have at least 8 major parties to choose from. So the respondents in this survey are asked what they think about all political parties and asked to rate them on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 means that they strongly dislike the party, and 10 means that they strongly like the party. So and based on these numbers, it's possible to actually calculate different kinds of measures of how effectively polarized people are, or Finland is, because I mean, it's a crude measure. It doesn't specifically ask about feeling, but still, like and dislike is a sort of emotional thing more than actually how objectively how far away you are ideologically from a certain party. So it could be that you don't like the party leader, it could be you don't like the party's ideas, or something else. It doesn't sort of take into account why you don't like or why you like a party. It's enough that you like or dislike it. So how does it look then? In Finland, and of course I'm interested in Sweden as my previous home country, so I added this one for comparison using some corresponding Swedish data. Here, once again, we have a nice little plot. The red line is Finland and the blue line is Sweden. And down here at the horizontal axle, we have different election years. I have tried to find the closest year possible. So the first line here is 2002 in Sweden and 2003 in Finland, and then it goes on until last national election in Sweden was 2018, and the last one in Finland was 2019. And on the vertical axis, we see a measure of affective polarization. Now, this isn't really calculated the same way as in the United States. I have to have a slightly different approaches to take into account that we have so many political parties. So what this measure actually shows is absence of neutrality. I focus sort of on the empty middle ground part of political polarization. So at the top of the scale, number 5, that would mean that all voters rate or score the parties as either extremely liked or strongly disliked on the scale. There's no in between. The parties are either good or bad. There's no neutrality towards the parties. So if all voters give all parties either the highest or the lowest score, then we would end up at the top of the scales. And similar at the bottom, that would mean that every voter answers the survey and gives every party an equal score. So they are completely neutral in their opinions on which party is more liked and which one is more disliked. So what do we see here? Well, in 2002 and 2003, about the time when I moved to Finland and onward, Sweden is definitely more effectively polarized than Finland. So the sort of my subjective experience when I moved to Finland and saw that, oh, things work differently, this is actually reflected here in the levels of polarization we can see, and this was quite an interesting finding. So then we see that polarization increases here over time, and then in Sweden at least the curve flattens out. But in Finland, it sort of dives down, but then again, it increases again in 2019. So, and the gap towards Sweden is closing. So this is sort of also confirms the intuition that Finland is becoming more and more like Sweden when it comes to political climates. But the question is, what do we do with this information? So polarization is increasing. Is it bad? Is it good? Is it dangerous? Well, that's the question. Should we be worried about this? So, okay, the main point of measuring polarization in this way, there are of course many other ways to measure it, but what we can measure, we can also examine closer and understand how it's associated to other kinds of phenomena and see what's driving it. And when we understand something, we know better if and when we should be worried. Nonetheless, if we look around, we see that democracy still seems to be working. Decisions are made, compromises are made, politicians speak to each other, even though they might sound a little bit more angry, and so on. So why should we worry? Could it even be so that it's a good thing that we finally have a little bit more of political polarization? We see some passion in politics, and people get inspired to participate more, because if there is no conflict, why should people care? Yeah, and this is a very valid point. We'll get back to this. However, as polarization increases, it also creates another set of problems and also feeds back to sort of reinforce this kind of polarization, which also creates more polarization. And to mention a few of these problems, we'll get back to the more severe ones later on, is a phenomenon called negative partisanship. And this is when political participation is driven not so much by positive association with a party or an ideology that you want to accomplish something. It's more of a negative thing. You dislike a certain party or political camp and you want to keep them out of power. Now, if this logic takes over in the political system, it means that the sides don't care about actually accomplishing anything or doing good themselves. All that will matter is to keep the other side out of power. So people will engage in politics just to keep the other side out without any positive goal in mind. And this results in all kinds of ugly things like negative campaigning and digging up dirt on the other side instead of presenting positive visions. Furthermore, political polarization tends to rather quickly spill over into normal social life. For example, there was an experiment or a study for some time ago showing that people are much more willing to discriminate socially against other people based on which party they support, much more so than, for example, based on language, religion, or ethnicity or something like that. So political divisions have a tendency to really very quickly spill over in how we sort of behave towards each other. Perhaps for example, from time to time we hear about people unfriending people on Facebook, for example, for being too much on the other side of politics and so on. Those kind of things happen all the time. But we'll not dwell on the negative aspects right now. We'll return to the argument that political polarization could actually be a good thing. So, the case for good political polarization. Much of the things we think today of as good developments have been the result of political polarization. They haven't happened despite political polarization, but because of political polarization. Here on the image, for example, we see activists for political rights for women. These are British ones, and well, this struggle definitely didn't happen without a lot of trouble on the way and a lot of ugliness and conflicts. But ultimately, it ended in something that we consider to be a good thing today. So the first argument to be made for the political polarization as a force for good is that it's actually we should remember that it is a necessary component of democracy. Democracy is not just about cooperation and agreeing; it's about managing all kinds of conflicts that appear in society, because conflicts will always come, and we need a way to manage them. And to manage these kind of conflicts, we need to be able to advocate for different kind of causes and mobilize support. And this, of course, means that because nothing is uncomplicated, there are always different kind of trade-offs and legitimate counter-arguments. So when you mobilize support for something, some other one will mobilize counter-mobilize support for the other side, and this way we can't have democracy without some level of polarization in this way, that we split over issues and divide into different sides over the questions of our time. And we can also think of what would actually too little polarization mean in society. If we imagine that there is no polarization at all, well, first of all, it would mean we lack options. We can't imagine what's the alternative to how do we have it today. Do we have any other visions that we could switch to if this one doesn't work out? It could also mean that the government, or there is a technocratic rule. Nobody sort of cares about what happens in politics. It's up to a few technocrats to just administer society. And that would mean citizens are really passive. Ultimately, perhaps this is a philosophical argument to be discussed over a beer or a coffee at some point. But I mean, it's perfectly valid to consider a society that has too little polarization and actually think that that's a little bit dysfunctional, and we would need more polarization for this to actually work. And then another benefit of polarization is that it actually forces us to think, act, and make progress on issues. And there's a real, this is called the argument for adversarial reasoning, meaning that we all have our blind spots and we can't see them ourselves. So we need an opponent to sort of attack us and point out on our weak spots, attack our blind sides and point out where we are wrong. Then we can sort of respond, we are being forced to respond to that and adapt and develop. And we do the same for them, and they are forced to adapt and develop. And this is not always pretty or nice at all. It could get really ugly, but it forces us to actually think about issues and really severe problems that perhaps it would be easier to turn a blind eye to them otherwise, if polarization didn't sort of put things on edge and force us to deal with them. So in this way, polarization could be also a tool for progressing society towards a greater good. But of course, we could also get, in the same way as we get too little polarization, we can have too much polarization. And that's the question: when do we get too much polarization? So it turns bad. Now, this is the tricky question, because you can't find a certain number of or a level of polarization. This is a very complex thing, so it always depends on the context. But I found a conflict escalation model that I think is very helpful in understanding these things. It's by Friedrich Glassel, It's used in all kinds of sort of organizational conflicts, and then it could also make sense in its kind of political polarization conflict. So it defines several stages of conflicts. And at the first stage, a conflict starts out with sort of general discussion. You hard the position on a topic hard, and you go over from discussion to debate. The sides are crystallized, and at some point when debate doesn't work, the different parties start sort of taking unilateral action to get things done, and the other ones oppose them. But if a conflict is resolved at this stage, it could still be a win-win for both sides. But if it escalates to the next stage, it starts becoming less and less about the actual issue at hand, and more about the relations between the two sides arguing. So here, more and more, the sides are viewing each other not as just having a bad or slightly inferior or wrong opinion. No, they start viewing the other side as actually morally corrupted, evil, the forces of darkness in one way or another. So at this stage, it's become about the relation between the competing groups. So you try to keep the other people, the bad people, out of power, and your side in power, and you try to sort of make the other side lose face, drop the mask, so the sort of general public see them for what they truly are. They're bad, corrupt people, and that's why why they have so strange opinions, because they're bad to the core, and the side starts to go actually threatening each other to get their will through. And at this point, it turns from about the issue to becoming a struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Only if each side sees themselves as the force of good, of course. And if it still escalates, we get into a conflict stage where everyone will lose out. So then the sides starting hitting each other, damaging each other, eliminating the enemy. And if nothing works, they prefer to go together down into the abyss than actually allowing the other side to win. And I would argue that somewhere at stage 2 or stage 3 somewhere at stage 2, we reach a turning point when polarization actually turns into a really bad direction and starts to run amok in a way that actually hurts society more than it helps to solve any of the issues we have. How does it look, this kind of damage that polarization can do? Well, once it starts running amok, there are a few things that have been identified in the research literature. One is political gridlock. When the sides are sort of locked in conflict, they can't get anything else done. All kinds of other agreements that needs to be done to make a country function, they're ignored. It's all about the greater conflict between the two sides. And this kind of gridlock, when nothing gets done, of course, people's trust in democracy erodes, and things could in worst case, start collapsing, and we could see democracy slowly breaking down over time. But perhaps the greatest risk with severe political polarization is that it creates an excellent environment for leaders who have authoritarian ambitions to exploit the situation. Now, in a study on polarization and democracy recently, which examined cases of democratic breakdown during the recent decades, it was found that around half the cases was a consequence of severe political polarization. And this is how it works. So even though the supporters of the one side have the strong democratic will, they value democracy, they want democracy. When they dislike the other side enough, they will sort of see through the look in the other direction when their own leadership start implementing different kind of undemocratic or authoritarian reforms to secure their power, because the alternative to actually go over to the opposition and vote down their own leaders, it's not happening. It's totally unthinkable. So therefore they are sort of forced to accept these kind of slow reforms toward authoritarianism because of the strong dislike of the other side, and And the authoritarian leaders know this and they exploit this. So this is perhaps the most dangerous development in severely polarized societies. There we have an example from Turkey, Erdogan. Now this sounds rather grim in worst case, but so the question is, what can we do to actually make sure that polarization don't get out of hand at some point in the future, which we really can't define beforehand? One thing to realize is that depolarization, it doesn't happen overnight. It's often a question of slow change over time, or simply decides exhausting themselves, new generations taking over, new conflicts becoming relevant, old conflicts becoming irrelevant. So in the face of this, can something be done at all against political polarization, or is it just a force out of control running amok? Well, now we come to this point where I have to say that I'm not an expert. I haven't researched depolarization, but at least I have a few ideas along the way. One thing perhaps we could learn from the COVID pandemic recently, and is that if political polarization is a kind of dynamic that can't be avoided and that it could spiral out of control, then at least perhaps we can do the same as with the pandemic. We could try to flatten the curve so at least it sort of doesn't go over the point where it does permanent damage to society. So how can we flatten the curve? Well, here are some of my ideas. They might work, they might not work, they might be better out there, but here we go. So first of all, we should stand our ground and do what we believe is right in a democracy. Political polarization is very often about issues that have a moral dimension. For example, is it how do we deal with refugees? For some, the only moral position is to actually help everyone we can to whatever costs. To other ones, the moral position would be, we should first take care of our own in-group, and then we can help other people if we still have the capacity. So there are very different ways of moral reasoning out there. So you shouldn't abandon your morals just because the other side doesn't agree. But that doesn't mean you should create unnecessary enemies. Instead, you should try to go about it in a constructive way. Polarization is it's actually sort of a game of mutual provocation. The other side does something, and one's own side uses it to sort of as a provocation, an excuse to do a counter provocation, and it goes back and forth in this kind of vicious cycle. So this is kind of game we should avoid to participate in. One way of doing this is to try to argue with ideas and principles and not against people. So actually focus on what is being said, not who is saying it and what's wrong with the person who is saying it. So when you argue against something, argue against the idea, not the person. Of course, this is much easier said than done, because in many cases, an idea or a principle could be at the core of someone's identity. So if you sort of attack or question a certain idea or view of reality, it could feel like an existential threat to the other person. Nonetheless, we need to try to separate these two, even if we're in severe disagreement. One way of doing this is to actually try to make steelman arguments, not strawman arguments. A strawman argument is when you make a straw man out of the opponent. You misrepresent the opponent's argument in a way that is much easier to ridicule or attack, and then you argue against that. But the steelman argument is opposite to that. You need to try to understand and know what your opponent is trying to achieve. And they make the best possible argument for them, and then argue against that argument. And this way, we can have a much better quality of the political discussion. This also means that you have to give the devil his due, even if you feel the other side is they're really bad, but still they may have something useful to contribute. They may have something to teach you. They may have a valid point on occasion, and it's important that this is recognized, and then they can do the same back to you, hopefully. And in this way, we can build bridges, and we can seek out more things that actually unites us instead of divides us. So that's the trick, how to stay united even though we are divided on certain issues. But of course, politics is complicated. It's about sometimes very serious grievances, injustices, about morality. So it is truly difficult and very difficult to navigate and know what the right path is into this. But if you can at least try to flatten the curve so it doesn't get out of hand, then I think much is won. With that, we return to our original question about polarization. Is it good, bad, or just ugly? And the short answer to this question is yes. It's all of those things. It depends on so many things. It will always be ugly, but whether it's good or bad partly depends on how we ourselves deal with it, how our leaders deal with it, how the general dynamic develops. But we can all do our best to actually try to turn it into a good direction instead of a bad direction. So with this, I thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming discussion and questions. Thank you.